Section 28, Popper goes on to say, in the foregoing section, I introduced the term degree of corroboration to characterise the degree to which a hypothesis has stood up to tests. In the present section, I intend to discuss merely a terminological issue, my reasons for proposing to speak of degree of corroboration, rather than of the probability of a hypothesis in the light of the tests. My main reason is, of course, that the latter phrase, although in itself perfectly legitimate, is liable to lead to confusion." End quote. So where I disagree is it's not perfectly legitimate. I don't think there is such a thing as probability of a hypothesis in the light of the tests. I just don't think there's any point of speaking in that way. And his attempt to improve this by saying, well, I'm not going to talk about probability, I'm instead going to talk about corroboration, is a false dichotomy. Both of these approaches, unusually for Popper, can be rejected because of Popper's own best solution, which is what we're doing is ruling out all the other theories, left with only one that doesn't need, so we don't need to be concerned about corroboration. We just need to be concerned about whether or not our theory solves our problem, explains our phenomena, has no other rivals that are yet to be ruled out by experimental tests, which in science, they always are. At least eventually, Popper spends many, many pages criticising, and I think rightly, the whole language of probability to a large extent and the whole application of probability to epistemology. He highlights errors, and it's very much worth reading. I'm not going to read through it now. As I say, this is already getting very long and perhaps I'm losing part of my audience. But let me pick it up where Popper does try to introduce an example. And so where he tries to justify, for want of another word, his use of this whole concept of corroboration or degree of corroboration. He goes on to say, quote, "No rule of content holds for the first sense of probability, which I call degree of corroboration. On the contrary, most physicists will say that Maxwell's theory of light is more probable in the first sense, that is to say, better corroborated or better tested than Fresnel's theory of light. The reason is that Maxwell's theory has been more widely and more severely tested, even in fields in which Fresnel's theory cannot be tested. At the same time, Maxwell's theory has a much greater logical content than Fresnel's. Maxwell's is a wave theory of light and a theory of electromagnetism, while Fresnel's is merely a wave theory of light. Thus, Maxwell's theory, although more probable in the sense of being better corroborated or better tested, is at the same time less probable in the sense of the second usage of the word, which is also very well established, especially if we are thinking not so much of the tests successfully passed by a hypothesis, but rather the chances that an event will occur." End quote. Again, I think this is all useless. I don't think that we need to worry about how many, counting up, how many successfully passed tests a particular hypothesis has managed to pass. If this was the case, then my mystery about why is it on this view of things being more probable the more tests they passed, why is it that the day before Newton's theory of gravity was finally once and for all refuted by Eddington's experiment, why was it that day, apparently, its probability of truth was at its highest because it was that day that it had passed the most tests. Thousands, millions of tests perhaps. Every time someone observed anything that could have been explained by Newton's theory of gravity, it was. Newton's theory of gravity had passed all of these tests, and not passed some. But apparently, Einstein's theory, which was brand new, had not passed as many tests. It simply hadn't. Not many people had applied it to certain problems. Certainly Albert Einstein had, and maybe a few other physicists who understood the theory at the time in 1919. But really, it hadn't been used to solve problems, so it wasn't passing tests. But that's irrelevant. It doesn't matter how many tests it's passed. It can be the best explanation. It can be closer to true, closer to describing reality than any other alternative, including Newton's, which had have passed more tests. This whole idea of corroboration introduces a problem which doesn't need to be solved. The problem would be, well, Newton's theory has been very heavily corroborated by all of these tests that went before. But Einstein's theory had not yet been corroborated. Who cares about corroboration? It's about refutation and explanation. And when we have two competing explanations, we seek a method of refutation, of trying to rule it out. That's exactly what happens. Now, let me go towards the end of this particular section and finally tie up loose ends about this. And why, again, I would love to be able to speak to Popper about this, because Popper almost admits, he almost admits in this very chapter that he's making a mistake. I'll just read. He says, quote, and this is coming from page number 228 of Realism and the Aim of Science. He writes, quote, "There is, unfortunately, the danger of another terminological confusion. Until recently, in fact, until the logic of scientific discovery was in galley proof, I did not use the term degree of corroboration, but in its place, the term degree of confirmation. And I made use of this term for precisely the same reason, because of the need to avoid the term probability. Therefore, I must now make clear why I have decided to change my terminology after using it in at least half a dozen publications," end quote. Okay, I'm not going to go on with his explanation here about why he's chosen to change tack to using degree of corroboration. He's saying right there that he wants to avoid the term probability. He understands that his own epistemology entails that you can't say things like this hypothesis is probably true, and you're not even aiming for something to be probably true or certainly true or anything like that. But despite that, because he feels like he needed to have some replacement for this whole idea of things being more probable, a particular theory being more probable, but he knows that that's a mistake. He knows that that's wrong. He knows that he's not trying to, and our project rather, in science and anywhere else, is not to try and find the most probable theory. That's not what we're trying to do. But he thinks he needs a replacement for that. So at first, in the logic of scientific discovery, at first, his best guess was to say, well, rather than talk about how probable a particular theory is, he's going to talk about the degree of confirmation, how well confirmed a theory is. And now, decades later in writing this book, on reflection, he's realized, whoa, I shouldn't have been talking about degree of confirmation. We can't confirm our theories or partly confirm our theories or anything like that. He realizes that's wrong. But he still wants something else. He wants corroboration now to fill the void. But the fact is, there is no void. His own philosophy does away with that whole thing, that whole way of speaking and thinking, this whole idea of this particular theory is more probable, this particular theory is more confirmed or best confirmed, or this theory even has a higher degree of corroboration. I think all of that is not a part of Popperian epistemology. Popperian epistemology is about trying to create good explanations. And if you're lucky, as I've said for about the 10th time in this episode alone, if you're lucky, you might have competing explanations. That's extremely rare. But if you do, then you do what Popper has explained. You come up with the experimental test that rules out all but one. Never mind how probable that theory is. Never mind if it's certain or has some degree of certainty. And never mind if it's been corroborated by repeated observations. That's not important. What's important is whether or not your theory or explanation actually does the job of accounting for those observations, that finite set of observations, and then allows you to infer what is true about the rest of physical reality, because you're explaining the rest of physical reality. So your predictions about the rest of physical reality are derived from that explanation. But it's not the other way around. You're not deriving the explanation from the finite set of observations and then predicting that, therefore, that finite set of observations in some way inductively infers or entails that a particular set of observations will continue. In fact, it might say quite the opposite, that the explanation of this particular finite set of observations says that tomorrow they're not going to continue for whatever reason.